Medieval society was structured in a way that made hunger inevitable for the masses. The feudal system created a pyramid, where the few at the top consumed the labor and resources of the many at the bottom. Lords and nobility could feast on multiple courses, roasted meats, fine wines, exotic spices, and white bread made from the finest wheat, while their serfs survived on scraps. The scale of inequality was breathtaking. A single feast at a noble's table could consume more resources than an entire peasant family would see in a year. Medieval banquets were displays of obscene wealth, multiple courses featuring exotic meats like swan, peacock, and venison, accompanied by expensive imported spices, fine wines, and elaborate desserts made with precious sugar. Meanwhile, peasant families would share a single loaf of coarse bread among 6 or 8 people. Their meat consisted of occasional scraps, gristle, bones with tiny amounts of flesh still clinging to them, or the internal organs that the nobility considered too disgusting to eat. A peasant might taste actual meat only a few times per year, usually during religious festivals when the Lord was expected to show some generosity. Medieval hunger and famine, when survival became humanity's greatest enemy. Imagine being so desperate for food that you consider eating your own children. Imagine watching your neighbors slowly waste away, their bodies consuming themselves from the inside out. This isn't the plot of some horror movie. This was daily reality for millions of people during medieval Europe's darkest periods of famine. Now, before you think this is just another tale from the distant past, consider this. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1317 killed more people than most wars, and it did so in ways that would make even the most hardened warriors weep. Parents abandoned their babies on church steps. Entire villages turned to cannibalism. And the wealthy? They continued feasting while the poor literally ate dirt to fill their stomachs. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will change forever how you think about hunger, survival, and what human beings are truly capable of when pushed to their absolute limits. When we think of medieval times, we often romanticize them. Knights in shining armor, grand castles, and elaborate feasts. But for the vast majority of medieval Europeans, life was a constant battle against starvation. Food security was a luxury that most people never experienced, and hunger was as common as breathing. The statistics alone paint a horrifying picture. In a typical medieval village, up to 40% of children died before reaching their 5th birthday, most from malnutrition-related diseases. Adult life expectancy hovered around 30 years, not because of violence or plague, but because bodies weakened by chronic hunger couldn't fight off even minor illnesses. Medieval peasants consumed between 1,500 and 2,000 calories per day during good times, barely enough for survival, and significantly less than what we consider adequate nutrition today. But these weren't just empty calories. The medieval diet was severely lacking in essential vitamins and minerals. Vitamin C deficiency caused scurvy, leading to bleeding gums, loose teeth, and eventually death. Vitamin D deficiency resulted in rickets, causing bone deformities that marked the poor for life. The seasonal nature of medieval agriculture made hunger cyclical and predictable. The period from late spring to early summer was known as the hunger gap, the time when the previous year's grain stores were depleted, but the new harvest hadn't yet come in. During these months, peasants survived on whatever they could forage: wild grasses, tree bark, and anything else that might provide even minimal nutrition. Food preservation was primitive and often failed completely. Without refrigeration or effective preservation techniques, grain could spoil, meat would rot, and vegetables would decay before they could be consumed. This meant that even when harvests were good, significant portions of food were lost to spoilage, making scarcity even worse. The medieval diet was brutally simple and utterly insufficient. For peasants, who made up roughly 90% of the population, every meal was a gamble with survival. The peasants' main food was a dark bread made out of rye grain. They ate a kind of stew called pottage, made from the peas, beans, and onions that they grew in their gardens. Their only sweet food was the berries, nuts, and honey that they collected from the woods. But even this meager diet was considered fortunate. When harvests failed, people ate things that would horrify us today. Should they be lacking in grain following a bad harvest, other ingredients would be substituted into the mixture, including acorns, beans, and peas. And when those ran out, they ate bark. They ate grass. They ate anything that might fill the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs. The bread that formed the foundation of medieval diet was often more punishment than nourishment. Barley, oats, and rye were eaten by the poor, while wheat was generally more expensive. The poor consumed bread made from rye and barley that was coarse, dense, and difficult to digest. Rye and barley breads were regarded negatively, and not just for their flavor, as they tended to have a laxative effect and were less easily digested. Even worse, rye bread carried a hidden danger that could drive entire communities insane. Ergot, a fungus that grew on rye grain, contained compounds similar to LSD. When consumed regularly, it caused a condition called ergotism, or St. Anthony's fire. Anthony's fire. Victims experienced hallucinations, seizures, and burning sensations in their limbs. In severe cases, their extremities would literally rot away while they were still alive. Imagine watching your fingers and toes blacken and fall off, all while experiencing terrifying visions that you couldn't escape. While peasants starved, there was an entire class of people who profited from their misery. Grain merchants, money lenders, and even some church officials turned famine into financial opportunity. These merchants would buy up grain supplies during good harvests, store them in warehouses, and then sell them at astronomical prices when scarcity hit. During the Great Famine, grain prices increased by 800% in some regions. A bushel of wheat that cost 5 shillings in normal times could sell for 40 shillings during peak famine conditions. This wasn't just market forces at work. It was deliberate manipulation of life and death resources for profit. The practice of forestalling, buying up food supplies before they reached market to artificially inflate prices, was technically illegal but widely practiced. Wealthy merchants would send agents to intercept grain shipments, purchase entire harvests directly from farmers, and create artificial scarcity in urban markets. While people died in the streets, these merchants accumulated vast fortunes. Church officials, who were supposed to provide charity to the poor, often participated in these schemes. Monasteries that controlled vast agricultural lands would sell their grain to the highest bidder, rather than feeding the starving masses at their gates. The very institutions that preached about Christian charity were complicit in turning hunger into profit. Some merchants went even further, lending money to desperate families at usurious interest rates, knowing that the borrowers would never be able to repay. When families defaulted, which was inevitable, the lenders would seize their land, tools, and even their children as debt slaves. Entire family lineages were destroyed by predatory lending during famine periods. This wasn't just inequality. It was systematic starvation used as a tool of control. Peasants were bound to the land and couldn't leave to seek better conditions. They owed their lords not just labor, but also a portion of everything they produced. In good years, this left them with barely enough to survive. In bad years, it was a death sentence. The wealthy maintained granaries and food stores that could last through multiple failed harvests. They had access to preserved meats, imported goods, and the best portions of every crop. Meanwhile, peasants had no safety net whatsoever. A single bad harvest meant watching their children slowly starve to death. Women and children suffered the most in this cruel hierarchy. In times of extreme scarcity, families would prioritize feeding adult men who could work, leaving women and children to subsist on even smaller rations. Pregnant and nursing mothers often died alongside their babies, their bodies unable to sustain both themselves and their children. Nothing in medieval history compares to the horror of the Great Famine of 1315 to 1317. The period was marked by extreme levels of crime, disease, mass death, and even cannibalism and infanticide. This wasn't just food scarcity, it was the complete breakdown of civilization itself. The famine began with catastrophic weather. Torrential rains destroyed crops across northern Europe, creating conditions that would persist for years. In 1315, the return was devastating. Now you reaped 1 grain for every 2 planted. Had they known it, they would have been better off not sowing seeds in the spring. But of course, they did not know that this spell of bad weather would devastate crops for almost 2 years. Think about that for a moment. Farmers planted 2 seeds and harvested only 1. They would have been better off eating their seed grain than planting it. But they couldn't have known that the nightmare was just beginning. The weather patterns that caused the Great Famine were unlike anything Europeans had experienced in living memory. The summer of 1314 had been unusually wet, and the harvest was poor. But what followed was unprecedented. Torrential rains that began in spring 1315 and continued almost without break through the summer and into the fall. Rivers flooded repeatedly, washing away crops and drowning livestock. The constant moisture created perfect conditions for plant diseases and crop rot. In some regions, the grain harvest was so poor that it yielded only 1/8 of what had been planted. Imagine the desperation of farmers who had worked all season only to realize that their entire year's labor had produced less food than they had put into the ground. The psychological impact was devastating. These people had farmed the same land for generations, and suddenly nothing they knew about agriculture seemed to work. The flooding also disrupted transportation networks, making it impossible to move food from areas with small surpluses to regions facing total crop failure. Roads became impassable quagmires, bridges were washed out, and rivers were too swollen and dangerous for safe travel. Even if food was available somewhere, there was no way to get it to where it was needed most. Salt production, crucial for food preservation, also collapsed during the famine. Salt was produced by evaporating seawater in coastal areas, but the constant rains made this impossible. Without salt, even the small amounts of food that were available couldn't be preserved for future consumption, making the crisis even worse. As the famine deepened, people made increasingly desperate choices. Things got so bad in the winter of 1315/1316 that the peasants ate the seed grain they had stored for planting in the spring. This created a vicious cycle. By eating next year's crops, they guaranteed that the famine would continue. But when your children are dying in front of you, long-term planning becomes impossible. The livestock died along with the people. Additionally, a severe outbreak of cattle disease drastically reduced livestock populations, notably sheep and cattle, by as much as 80%. Imagine losing 80% of all farm animals. No milk, no cheese, no meat, and no animals to help with farm work. The foundation of medieval agriculture simply collapsed. Among all the horrors of medieval famine, perhaps none were more heartbreaking than what happened to children. Young bodies, still developing and requiring more calories per pound of body weight than adults, were the first and worst victims of food shortages. The Great Famine created an entire generation of children who never knew what it felt like to have a full stomach. Child abandonment reached epidemic levels during famine years. Parents, Facing the impossible choice between watching all their children starve or saving the ones they could, made decisions that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. Church records from monasteries and convents document hundreds of infants and toddlers left at their gates during the Great Famine, often with notes pleading for the religious communities to care for the children their parents could no longer feed. But abandonment wasn't the worst fate that befell medieval children during famines. Historical accounts, though difficult to read, document cases of infanticide, parents killing their youngest children to conserve food for older siblings who had a better chance of survival. The logic was brutal, but pragmatic. Better to save one child than lose them all. Children who did survive the famines were often permanently damaged by malnutrition. Stunted growth, developmental delays, and cognitive impairments were common among famine survivors. These children grew up to become adults who were physically and mentally compromised, creating a cycle of poverty and vulnerability that could last for generations. The psychological trauma inflicted on surviving children was equally devastating. Many developed what we would now recognize as hoarding behaviors, hiding scraps of food obsessively and becoming violently protective of any resources they acquired. Others became emotionally withdrawn, unable to form normal attachments after experiencing the ultimate betrayal of being abandoned by their parents. Let's pause here because this isn't something we can just gloss over. We're talking about parents abandoning their own children, not because they didn't love them, but because they literally couldn't keep them alive. Church records from this period document hundreds of infants left at monastery doors, their parents hoping that somehow the monks would have food when they didn't. But it gets worse. By 1316, there were even rumors of cannibalism. In their misery and starvation, many people begged, stole, and murdered for what little food they could find. These weren't just rumors. Chroniclers of the time repeatedly recorded, in acts of severe desperation, recurrent incidents of cannibalism across Europe. Medieval chroniclers, who were typically monks and church officials, documented these horrors in their records. They wrote about parents eating their own children, neighbors turning on neighbors, and entire communities descending into a nightmare where human flesh became just another source of protein. The psychological trauma of this period can't be overstated. Survivors carried these memories for the rest of their lives. Entire generations grew up with the knowledge that in the darkest moments, their society had completely failed them. Trust between neighbors evaporated. The social bonds that held communities together were shattered. What does it actually feel like to starve to death? This isn't a question we ask lightly, but understanding the physical reality of medieval famine helps us comprehend just how desperate people became. Starvation is a slow, agonizing process that attacks both body and mind. In the first days without food, the body burns through its glucose reserves. People become irritable, shaky, and unable to concentrate. But this is just the beginning. After a few days, the body begins consuming stored fat. Weight drops rapidly, but the person can still function somewhat normally. This might last a few weeks for someone who was healthy to begin with, but medieval peasants rarely had excess fat to burn. Next comes the truly horrific phase. The body begins consuming muscle tissue, including heart muscle. People become skeletal, their faces gaunt, and their eyes hollow. They lose the ability to regulate their body temperature. Their hair falls out. Their skin becomes thin and tears easily. But the mental effects are perhaps even worse. Starvation causes severe depression, anxiety, and obsessive thoughts about food. People become apathetic and withdrawn. They lose interest in everything except finding their next meal. Social bonds dissolve as every interaction becomes about competition for scarce resources. In the final stages, the starving person's body begins shutting down non-essential functions. Their immune system fails, making them vulnerable to diseases that would normally be minor. Their heart struggles to pump blood through their weakened body. Eventually, they simply lie down and don't get up again. This process could take weeks or even months, and medieval peasants watched it happen to their loved ones over and over again. Parents watched their children waste away. Children watched their parents grow weaker each day, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Even when food was available, it often carried its own dangers. Medieval agricultural practices, combined with poor storage methods, meant that much of what people ate was contaminated, spoiled, or toxic. We've already discussed ergotism from rye bread, but that was just one of many food-related hazards. Grain stored in damp conditions developed molds that produced deadly toxins. Meat was often rotten by the time it reached peasant tables, carrying diseases that would devastate already weakened immune systems. During famines, people became even less selective about what they ate. They consumed grain that was clearly moldy, meat that was obviously spoiled, and plants that they weren't sure were safe. The alternative was certain death from starvation, so they took their chances with possible poisoning. Root vegetables like turnips and parsnips were often the last foods available during famines. But even these carried risks. Desperate people would dig up anything that looked edible, sometimes consuming poisonous plants that looked similar to safe ones. Without proper knowledge of botany, a family could accidentally poison themselves while trying to avoid starvation. Water sources were another constant danger. Medieval sanitation was virtually non-existent, and during famines, clean water became even scarcer. People drank from contaminated wells, streams polluted with human waste, and stagnant ponds that harbored deadly bacteria. Dysentery and cholera were common, adding disease to the already overwhelming burden of hunger. The Great Famine revealed something disturbing about human nature under extreme duress. When people are starving, moral frameworks that seem absolute begin to crumble. The line between civilized behavior and pure survival instinct becomes frighteningly thin. Medieval chroniclers documented not just the physical acts of cannibalism, but the psychological journey that led people there. It didn't happen overnight. First, people ate animals they normally wouldn't consider food: rats, cats, dogs, horses. They boiled leather to extract any possible nutrition. They made soup from bones that had been picked clean weeks earlier. But when even these desperate measures failed, some people crossed the ultimate line. They didn't start by eating strangers. They began with family members who had already died from starvation. The reasoning was pragmatic in its horror. The person was already dead, and the meat might keep the living alive a little longer. From there, it was a short step to more active measures. Historical records document cases of parents killing weakened children to feed stronger ones. Neighbors turned on neighbors. Travelers were murdered for their meager food supplies. The most chilling aspect of these accounts is how quickly these behaviors spread through communities. Once one family crossed the line, others followed. The social taboos that normally prevented such acts evaporated under the pressure of extreme hunger. The Great Famine finally began to ease around 1317, but its effects lasted for generations. It would not be until 1325 that food supplies returned to normality. Nearly a decade of suffering and trauma. The demographic impact was staggering. Historians estimate that the famine killed between 10% and 25% of the population in affected areas. Entire bloodlines were wiped out. Villages that had existed for centuries were abandoned and never reoccupied. But the psychological scars ran even deeper. The survivors of the Great Famine passed down stories of the horrors they had witnessed. Children who lived through this period grew up with a fundamentally different relationship with food, community, and trust. They hoarded resources obsessively. They viewed neighbors with suspicion. They lived in constant fear that the nightmare could return at any time. The famine also fundamentally altered European society. It exposed the failures of the feudal system and contributed to social unrest that would simmer for centuries. Peasants began to question why they should give their labor and crops to lords who had done nothing to protect them during the crisis. The Catholic Church, which had promised divine protection and portrayed suffering as God's will, also lost credibility. If God was truly looking after his flock, Why had he allowed such unprecedented suffering? This crisis of faith contributed to the religious upheavals that would follow in later centuries. The story of medieval hunger isn't just historical curiosity, it's a warning about what happens when food systems fail and social structures collapse. The Great Famine showed that civilization is far more fragile than we like to believe. In just 2 years, Northern Europe went from relative stability to complete social breakdown. People who had lived as neighbors for generations turned into enemies. Parents abandoned children they loved. Communities that had existed for centuries simply disappeared. What makes this even more sobering is that the Great Famine wasn't caused by war, plague, or natural disaster in the traditional sense. It was caused by weather, a few seasons of excessive rain that disrupted agricultural cycles. In our modern world, where climate change threatens to make extreme weather more common, the lessons of 1315 to 1317 should terrify us. The medieval period teaches us that hunger is more than just a lack of food. It's a complete breakdown of the social contract. When people can't feed their families, all other concerns become secondary. Laws, customs, moral codes, and religious beliefs all give way to the basic drive to survive. We also learn that the effects of famine extend far beyond the immediate crisis. The trauma of extreme hunger creates lasting changes in how people view the world, trust each other, and organize their societies. The survivors of medieval famines shaped European culture for centuries afterward, passing down both practical knowledge about food storage and preservation and deep psychological wounds that influenced art, literature, and politics.